Last night, under the warm glow of a downtown Portland bistro, my sister lifted her champagne glass and toasted herself. Around her, polished laughter filled the air, sharp and expensive. I sat at the end of the table, still in my work uniform, the faint smell of copper and dust clinging to me. I hadn't planned to come straight from the job site, but there hadn't been time to change. Tessa's celebration couldn't wait, she said. She looked radiant in silk, glowing with the kind of confidence only people who never missed a rent payment could afford. When her coworkers asked who I was, her eyes flickered hesitation, then embarrassment. She smiled too quickly and said, "My sister, Elena. She's in trades." The pause before trades cut deeper than any insult. I watched her lean closer to her boss, Miss Quinn, spinning stories about ambition and image. The moment our eyes met, she frowned, as if my presence stained her perfect picture. Then, with a careless laugh, she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Some people are just comfortable staying where they are. My sister's one of them." The table chuckled politely. My chest burned. Years of sacrifice, of long shifts and double paychecks, reduced to a joke over dessert. She leaned back, sipping her wine, and whispered, "Don't make this awkward, Elena. Try not to embarrass me." So I didn't. I stood, left my untouched plate on the table, and walked into the night. That night, I made a decision. At exactly 8:30 the next morning, she was on her knees, begging. I smiled and said, "Too late. If you've ever worked hard only to be mocked by the ones you helped, tell me in the comments. Hit like if you believe dignity speaks louder than money, and subscribe for more true stories of boundaries, betrayal, and justice." 2 years earlier, the nights had no edges, just long stretches of humming machines and fluorescent light. I was 28 and worked 2 shifts, one at the electrical plant and another wiring new solar panels across the city. Sleep came in fragments, like static between frequencies. Every hour I worked carried a purpose: to make sure my younger sister, Tessa Cruz, could finish her communications degree without debt. Back then, I believed that love meant endurance. Every time my boots hit the concrete before dawn, I reminded myself that she deserved an easier start than I ever had. Our parents, Marisol and David, called it sisterly duty. They said I was built tougher, more practical. While Tessa was made for better things, I accepted it as truth and filled the silence with overtime. My apartment was small, one room, metal walls that groaned when the wind turned. I kept a single photo of Tessa taped to the fridge, her freshman orientation picture, smiling beneath banners that said, "Welcome to the future." It made the exhaustion feel worthwhile. Every week, I wired money to her campus account and another transfer for rent. When my balance dipped close to zero, I picked up another Saturday shift and convinced myself it was temporary. Months blurred. My hands cracked from the cold, but the numbers on her tuition statements steadied me. I told no one about the sacrifices. It wasn't pride, it was survival. People like me didn't have safety nets, we built them for others. The first warning sign came one Sunday evening. Tessa called, her voice bright, describing a new phone she needed for class projects. I agreed, half listening, eyes on the overtime schedule. Later that week, a package arrived addressed to her at my apartment. Not a phone, but designer headphones and a handbag. I told myself the seller must have mixed up the order. Denial was easier than disappointment. When the credit card company offered an additional user card to help a family member build credit, I added Tessa without thinking. It felt like trust, like proof that we were in this together. I didn't tell our parents. I wanted this act of faith to be ours alone. At first, her charges were small coffee, textbooks, bus passes, then the statements thickened. Boutique names replaced bookstores, and the balances doubled overnight. I kept paying, telling myself she'd reimburse me after graduation. Love, I learned, can make math dishonest. One night, after finishing a 16-hour shift, I sat at my kitchen table sorting through the stack of bills. The power flickered once, as if the universe exhaled. My eyes stopped on the last page. Account past due. Minimum payment required immediately. The number printed beneath it was higher than my next paycheck. I tried to calculate how it happened, tracing each line, each charge, every small indulgence that had quietly multiplied into something unmanageable. There was no anger then, only a dull ache under my ribs, a recognition that something precious had begun to rot beneath the surface. Mom called the next day to remind me that Tessa's midterms were coming and she shouldn't worry about money. I promised she wouldn't have to. After the call, I sat on the edge of my bed, the card bill spread across my knees, and realized I was the only one worrying at all. That winter, I worked through storms that bent power lines like wet straw. The overtime checks covered the late fees, but never the principal. My body learned the rhythm of exhaustion: work, pay, repeat. I told myself I could endure a few more months until Tessa graduated. But late one night, while balancing the next set of invoices, I saw a new email from the bank. The subject line was brief, clinical, overdue payment, supplemental card. I clicked it open, staring at the numbers until the screen blurred. The amount due wasn't just overdue, it was impossible. Somewhere between my love and her carelessness, the balance had become a wall I couldn't climb. For the first time, I wondered if my sister's future was being built entirely from my exhaustion. And if so, how much of me would be left when she finally crossed her stage? By spring, the rain in Portland no longer felt cleansing. It sounded like debt tapping against the windows. I had learned to live by invoices. When they arrived, I worked more. When they didn't, I waited for the next storm. The overtime checks were no longer patches. They were confessions of how deep the cracks had spread. My sister, Tessa Cruz, had graduated by then and moved into a one-bedroom apartment near downtown. She called it independence. I called it another bill waiting to happen. Every time she mentioned new beginnings, I heard new expenses. Still, I couldn't bring myself to stop helping. Love made me obedient to guilt. The overdue balance on the shared credit line had finally stabilized, but only because I stopped checking. I paid the minimums, hoping silence could erase what numbers couldn't. Then, one morning, a white envelope slid under my apartment door, a copy of a pay or quit notice from her landlord, Mr. Harris. The letter said she was 2 months behind on rent and had listed me as the emergency contact. It wasn't my signature, but it was my name. I called the number on the notice, and his voice was brisk, professional, detached. She said her sister would handle it, he told me. I didn't correct him. I just transferred the rent before he hung up. It was easier than explaining family. Work became my refuge again. On the job site, the noise of machinery replaced thought. I logged every hour, every dollar, convincing myself that the more I worked, the more control I had. But beneath that logic, a quieter truth pressed against my ribs. I wasn't fixing anything. I was financing her denial. Tessa started posting photos of brunches and weekend trips with Aaron Pike, her new boyfriend. She wore clothes that still had store tags visible in reflections. Her captions talked about manifesting abundance. I never commented. The people who work with their hands rarely understand the language of manifestation. We understand effort and interest rates. One evening, after a double shift, I opened my phone to find 10 missed calls from Mom. Her message said Tessa had been crying something about unfair work pressure and jealous supervisors. When I reached her, she sounded fragile, asking for another short-term loan to catch up. I told her I'd think about it, though my checking account was already gasping. A week later, an email from her company's HR manager, Miss Quinn, landed in my inbox by mistake. The message was part of a forwarded chain. Tessa's name highlighted for repeated tardiness and misuse of company time. I didn't reply. I just sat there staring at the screen, realizing that her stories were splitting apart faster than I could mend them. The cracks in our foundation weren't financial anymore. They were moral, made from lies, reshaped by convenience. I began documenting everything. Every transaction, every wire transfer, every rent payment. The spreadsheet became both shield and evidence. Part of me felt paranoid. The other part felt prepared. Still, I couldn't hate her. Not yet. Each time I thought about stopping, I remembered her as a child, how she used to follow me around construction sites, pretending to fix imaginary walls. Somewhere along the way, I became the wall she leaned on, and she never learned how to stand on her own. But the final fracture came quietly. A thick envelope arrived one evening from Mr. Harris's office. Inside was an updated lease agreement. My eyes froze on a single line. Co-signer, Elena Cruz. My signature perfectly forged. The world tilted a little. For a full minute, I could hear my heart beat louder than the rain outside. The paper smelled of ink and betrayal. There was no call this time, no confrontation, just a slow, sinking realization that my name had become currency, spent without consent. I folded the document neatly and placed it in the same folder as the bank statements. Evidence, I thought, not anger. There would be a day to use it, and I needed to be ready. That night, as the city lights flickered beyond my window, I understood that the foundation wasn't just cracked, it was collapsing. And the only way to survive was to stop rebuilding what someone else kept breaking. The weeks that followed were strangely silent, the kind of quiet that hums beneath your skin. Bills still arrived, machines still groaned at work, but my body moved through it all as if underwater. Every breath carried the taste of exhaustion and disbelief. I had seen the forged signature, yet my mind refused to process it fully. Love, even when poisoned, doesn't die cleanly, it lingers, rotting slow. I stopped taking Tessa's calls. The first few days, my phone blinked with messages. Sweet at first, then defensive, then angry. By the end of the week, her tone turned syrupy again, the kind she used whenever she wanted something. I deleted every voicemail without listening. Cutting contact felt unnatural, but breathing through debt felt worse. Work offered no comfort. The winter projects had dried up, and my overtime vanished with them. The bills didn't. My landlord reminded me about rent increases. My truck needed repairs. Each expense felt like a test of endurance I hadn't studied for. One gray afternoon, a letter from Cascade Bank arrived in a thick envelope. Inside was a statement for a personal loan, $15,000 with my name printed in bold. I stared at it, uncomprehending. The date matched the week after I discovered the fake lease signature. My stomach twisted. I called the number listed, and the automated voice thanked me for being a valued customer. I wasn't their customer, but my name was. That night, sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the curve of my own forged signature, steady, practiced, perfect. Someone who knew me well had learned how to copy me completely. Mom, Marisol, called the next morning. Her voice carried that practiced gentleness reserved for family guilt. She spoke of Tessa's stress, her recent setbacks, her need for understanding. I could hear Dad, David, in the background saying, "Elena just doesn't get it." The old script played again, Tessa as fragile, me as ungrateful. I wanted to tell them about the forged documents, the fake accounts, the suffocating silence that came with being invisible until someone needed money. But I didn't. I let their words roll over me, leaving bruises no one could see. Explaining myself to people who had never listened felt like trying to rebuild a house still on fire. Days blurred again. Paychecks came, vanished. I began selling tools, small things first, then the heavier ones. Each sale felt like surrender. Yet even stripped of comfort, I felt a strange clarity settling in. When there's nothing left to give, truth becomes lighter to carry. The moment of fracture came unexpectedly. I returned home late after a 14-hour shift to find a new credit card envelope on my kitchen table. My name was embossed across the front, gold letters glinting under the overhead light. The card was real. The debt it represented was not mine. The activation slip bore an unfamiliar number, but the address was my own. I realized she hadn't just borrowed my credit anymore. She had learned to become me. There are sounds a human body makes when breaking, soft, inward things like air leaving a punctured tire. I sat on the floor, card in hand, and felt my heart beat slow until it matched the rhythm of the refrigerator humming beside me. The hum of survival. The hum of ending. That was when something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not even sadness, just precision. Like a builder measuring twice before cutting once. I gathered the forged lease, the bank letters, the unopened bills, stacking them neatly on the table. I labeled each folder by date, typed each transaction into a spreadsheet, and printed everything in duplicate. For the first time, I wasn't working to save her. I was preparing to end her reach. Outside, rain began again, soft and unending. Portland always had a way of washing away the noise, but this time, it felt different, like it was clearing a path. I stood by the window and realized the foundation hadn't only cracked, it had collapsed entirely. And maybe that was the point. Some things aren't meant to be rebuilt. Morning light cut through the blinds like a quiet accusation. I had slept maybe an hour, the folders stacked neatly on my kitchen table beside a cold cup of coffee. Each page inside those folders was a record of betrayal signatures, loan agreements, emails, evidence of someone who had once been my sister. By the time I reached Tessa Cruz's apartment, the city was still half asleep. Her building smelled of rain and detergent, clean in a way that felt false. I stood outside her door long enough to hear laughter through the walls, her laughter soft, unbothered, alive in a world where debt was just a word that happened to other people. When she finally opened the door, the hallway filled with perfume and artificial warmth. She looked exactly as she had on her social media posts. Perfect hair, new clothes, eyes bright from ignorance. For a moment, I tried to remember when I stopped recognizing her. Maybe it was the day she learned she could forge my name and still sleep soundly. I didn't speak. Words had become too expensive to waste. She tilted her head, smiling like someone greeting an old friend, and gestured for me to come in. I stepped past her into a living room that glowed with everything I had paid for: furniture, electronics, luxury stitched into every surface. It wasn't the room that hurt me. It was the ease with which she lived inside it. As she moved about the kitchen, my eyes caught a new handbag on the counter. The receipt, half crumpled beside it, carried the same credit card number that had once been mine. My chest tightened, not from surprise, but from recognition. I had built this comfort brick by brick, dollar by dollar, believing it was love. It had never been love. It was labor mistaken for loyalty. I left the folders on her marble countertop, each labeled with her name, each filled with proof. When she noticed, her laughter faltered, but I still said nothing. The silence stretched until it felt like judgment itself. I turned toward the door, feeling her confusion clawing at my back, but I didn't owe her understanding anymore. Outside, the morning air was cold enough to sting. My hands trembled not from fear, but release. The burden was no longer mine to carry. I drove straight to Cascade Bank, the folder marked Loan Fraud balanced on the passenger seat. The clerk at the counter didn't look up much as I spoke, but her hands stopped typing when she saw the signatures. She said an investigator would reach out. I nodded, leaving before she could offer sympathy. My next stop was Mr. Harris's office. The same man who'd once treated me like a background character now glanced at the forged lease and went pale. He promised to handle it through legal channels. I didn't ask what that meant. Justice, I had learned, doesn't always look like punishment. It just looks like balance. That afternoon, the sky turned copper. The city pulsed with traffic, but inside my truck, the world felt still. For the first time in years, I wasn't hurrying anywhere. The noise in my head had quieted. I thought about the years I'd traded away, the holidays I'd worked through, the exhaustion I had mistaken for purpose. Every memory carried a cost, and I had finally paid enough. My phone buzzed once. A message alert flashed across the screen from an unknown number. I opened it without thinking. Your account has been temporarily frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. Please contact support. The account listed wasn't mine. It was Tessa's. I let the phone fall onto the passenger seat and exhaled. A long, steady sound that felt almost like laughter. The universe, it seemed, had perfect timing. As dusk settled, I drove home in silence, the folders now lighter, the road clearer than it had ever been. Somewhere behind me, a world I had built for someone else was beginning to crumble. And for the first time, I didn't turn around to watch. The morning after the silence broke, I woke to an inbox full of messages. News travels faster than guilt. Tessa Cruz's name had appeared in small, quiet corners of the internet, a note about a terminated employment, an ongoing fraud review, an investigation pending. It was surreal to see her name detached from mine, standing alone in a place I had never wished her to be. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty, like someone who had finally finished carrying something too heavy to remember why it mattered. The absence of her chaos was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. "Mom," Marisol called first. Her voice trembled under layers of practiced calm. She spoke about mistakes, about how Tessa just needs time, and how families should pull together. I could hear Dad, David, in the background, quieter now, maybe ashamed, maybe tired. But guilt has never been my language. I told her there was nothing left to pull. The line stayed silent long enough for both of us to understand it was the last call that would matter. That evening, I went through my apartment and began sorting through the leftovers of a life built around someone else's needs. I threw out receipts, letters, old statements, and all the quiet reminders of how easily I'd confused love with labor. The folders were gone, now turned over to lawyers, banks, and investigators. All that remained was space. Days folded into each other, quiet and slow. I returned to work, but only part-time. I stopped chasing extra shifts, stopped checking bank balances with fear. My debt began to shrink, not because of luck, but because I had stopped letting it multiply through her hands, the simple arithmetic of peace. When the letter from Cascade Bank arrived, I almost ignored it. But inside, beneath a formal note thanking me for assisting their investigation, there was a small reimbursement check, insignificant compared to what I'd lost, yet symbolic. Proof that some systems, unlike people, occasionally corrected themselves. I placed the check in a drawer and closed it. Money wasn't the point anymore. The currency of freedom was silence, and I finally had enough. Later that week, a plain brown envelope appeared in my mailbox. The handwriting was familiar, curved, confident, careless. No return address, just my name. Inside was a single folded paper, blank except for a small photograph tucked inside. 2 little girls sitting on a porch, one grinning, the other shielding her eyes from the sunday. I didn't need to check to know which one was me. For a long moment, I stood by the window, holding that picture. Memories didn't hurt anymore, they just existed. like dust that settles after demolition. Maybe she wanted forgiveness. Maybe she wanted to remind me that once, we were sisters before we became evidence against each other. But forgiveness requires trust, and trust, once erased, doesn't redraw itself. That evening, the river behind my apartment glimmered under the streetlights. I walked there without thinking, the envelope clutched in my hand. The air smelled like rain again, cleaner this time, almost honest. I watched the water move beneath the bridge, slow but steady, carrying everything it touched somewhere else. I unfolded the picture one last time. The faces on it didn't belong to who we had become. I let it slip from my fingers, watching the photo tilt, then vanish beneath the surface. It didn't sink, it drifted, as if the past refused to drown but no longer knew where to land. Walking home, the weight in my chest felt different, not gone, but transformed. Regret had shape once, now it was just air. I realized that closure wasn't a dramatic ending. It was a quiet one. Some losses don't break you, they define your edges. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small within my own life. I just felt free. A year later, life had become something quiet and manageable. The chaos that once filled my days had thinned into soft routines: early mornings, steady work, dinners eaten without a knot in my stomach. I lived in a small apartment overlooking the Willamette River, the kind of view that used to feel unattainable when every dollar I earned belonged to someone else. Now, it was mine. The city changed with the seasons, and I changed with it. My hands, once cracked from endless labor, had healed. I worked as a technical supervisor, now no overtime, no second job. Sometimes I missed the noise, the endless movement, but mostly I cherished the stillness. Silence had become its own form of wealth. I didn't think of Tessa Cruz often. Her name surfaced only when I checked old records or received stray emails from lawyers closing her case. I learned, through a brief article tucked in the local section of the news, that she'd pleaded guilty to falsifying documents and received 6 months probation, community service, and a fine she couldn't pay. There was no photograph, only words, but I didn't need an image. I could already see the expression she wore when the world stopped revolving around her. The article mentioned, "Family support unavailable." That line struck harder than I expected, not because it was wrong, but because it was finally true. For years, I had been her safety net, her invisible scaffolding. I had built her future brick by brick, until she mistook my labor for her right. Now, with no one left to hold her, gravity had done what I never could. It taught her the cost of weightlessness. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel revenge either. What I felt was distance, clean, irreversible distance. It was the kind of separation that doesn't ache anymore, just exists like a healed scar, proof of damage and of survival. One evening, as I left work, the streetlights flickered against the wet pavement. The air smelled like iron and rain. I passed a group of young women laughing outside a cafe, carefree and loud in the way only people untouched by betrayal could be. For a brief moment, I saw myself in them, not the version molded by duty, but the woman I might have been if love hadn't been confused with sacrifice. When I got home, I opened my notebook, the one I'd started after therapy, filled with fragments of memory and notes I never planned to share. I wrote only one sentence that night. Sometimes peace isn't forgiveness, it's the refusal to bleed for the same wound twice. The ink bled slightly on the page, but the words stayed steady. That was enough. I poured myself a cup of tea and stood by the window. Across the river, the city hummed with ordinary life sirens, laughter, someone playing guitar on a balcony. It all sounded distant, yet beautifully alive. I had spent so many years waiting for someone else's apology that I hadn't noticed how freedom never required it. It simply waited for me to claim it. Tessa might spend years trying to rebuild what she lost, or she might never try at all. That was no longer my burden to carry. The version of me that once chased approval, that once begged to be seen, was gone. What remained was smaller, perhaps lonelier, but whole. In the reflection of the glass, I saw my own face softened by the city lights. I didn't look victorious. I looked real, someone who had learned that love without respect is just captivity disguised as devotion. I closed the notebook, exhaled, and whispered the truth I had taken too long to learn. You can't save someone who's comfortable in your sacrifice. Outside, the rain returned, falling steady against the glass. Somewhere out there, a version of my sister was still learning what I had already mastered, that actions echo long after apologies fade. For her, it was too late. For me, it was finally enough. If this story reached something in you, leave a thought below. Have you ever given too much, only to realize it was never seen? Your voice might help someone else find their boundary too. If you believe in stories that heal through truth, Hit like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next one. Because every ending is just another chance to begin again stronger.